Well, welcome to this workshop from the SEEP Network. We are very pleased to have you joining us today and thrilled to have this panel that has assembled to join us in conversation about anti-Asian violence in context. And we are excited that this is the first of a series of conversations that we will be having over the next few months. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the executive director of the SEEP Network. And it is terrific to assemble these folks from around the country and across the church. And I'm not going to say anything else. I'm going to turn it over to Katie, our moderator, and thank all of our panelists for joining us today. And we look forward to having you all, our attendees, with us for this and future SEEP Network workshops. So Katie, off to you.
Thanks so much, Joe, and welcome and good afternoon. I'm the Reverend Katie Nakamura Ringers. I'm actually joining you from Birmingham, Alabama. Believe it or not, this is where I am from. And I work remotely. I'm on our presiding bishop's staff. I'm the staff officer for church planting. And I really want to thank you for being part of this webinar. It's actually a very new experience for me to be joining together with other Asian American sisters and brothers and having this conversation about racism. And that newness is part of maybe the nuance and the complexity of the conversation we're about to have. Joining me is Bishop Diana Akiyama, Bishop Alan Shin, Bernadette Ellerin, and Manoj Zakaria. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. We actually met yesterday, and that's when we started to realize that what's going on in the world around us, these acts of violence, but also the long history of racism that has been drug up by what's going on today it's really complicated, and it's got some complex roots. So I'm going to invite our panelists to talk about both the recent attacks, but also the nuance that this conversation brings to the wider conversations about race and prejudice in the United States. And then finally, we'd like to wrap it around to the experience of Asians and Asian Americans in the Episcopal Church. So I think what's going to happen is we'll have about 30 or 40 minutes of conversation or so. And as we're doing that, we invite you to list some comments and questions in the chat box, and we'll eventually wrap around and get to some of those as well. But to get us started for our four panelists, could I just invite you, as you will, to unmute, introduce yourself a little bit more fully, and tell us what made you say yes to being part of this panel. What's important to you as we have this conversation today? So whoever would like to jump in, go for it.
Sure, I'll go. I'm Alan Shen. I'm the suffragan bishop of the Diocese of New York. I'm also a Korean American immigrant. I came here as a child about 48 years ago. Firstly, let me thank the board of SEEP for hosting this forum and inviting me. I'm honored and humbled to be with you. Let me begin by sharing a couple of personal experiences. When the pandemic began last March, my wife and I took up daily walks for health and sanity. Then a couple of weeks into it, we were harassed by someone who called us China Virus and tried to run us over with his bike. That went on a couple of more weeks whenever he spotted us. Now I've been called many epithets and been told to go back home many times before, but never have I felt fearful for my life as I have felt this past year. And the second story is when I was elected bishop 7 years ago, I heard someone surmising the election result saying, after all that, we just elected a banana. Banana is yellow outside and white inside. It's a racist label which whitewashes the Asian identity invisible and makes an Asian person into a fake white person. So I live in this difficult tension between two voices. The voice that called me to this ministry, and the voice saying that I was elected because I'm a fake white person. But it keeps me humble for some reason, and keeps me reminded of the harsh reality of the racist culture in our society, and frankly, in our church. With all that has happened this past year, Alleluia this Easter had a particular note of poignancy for me. Within the joyful cry of Alleluia, I also hear a heartbroken and hopeful cry for justice and healing. Because without the hope of justice and healing, a risen life in Christ is but a hollow and meaningless existence. So my faith compels me, my belief in the resurrection compels me to stand up and speak up against the rising tide of anti-Asian violence. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Bernadette Ellerin, and thank you to the SEEP Network also for inviting me to share. I am the executive director of the Mission to End Modern Slavery. We're an organization with our roots in the Episcopal Church, and we organize and advocate and support victims of human trafficking here in the United States, majority of which come from the Asia Pacific region. So over 60% of the victims that we support are Asians here in the United States. And I said yes to being a part of this panel because honestly, when I first heard about the spike of Asian American violence in the news, I thought it was weird because I thought it was weird that the news was covering it. First of all, because I grew up with anti-Asian violence. Anti-Asian violence is something that is not new, right? But what is new is that it has visibility now, when in fact, anti-Asian violence for me has always been an invisible phenomenon. So I think it's important that we use this as to elevate the not just the visibility, but also elevate the conversation around violence, racism, white supremacy, and solidarity as well. So I'm very happy to be here and to be here with my fellow co-panelists who I all respect and admire.
Hi, I'm Diane Akiyama, and the newly elected Bishop of the Diocese of Oregon, and very honored to have been asked to speak on this panel and echo what has already been said. The voice of Asian Americans is often silenced because of the strange position that racism puts on us. And by that, I mean, the use of model minority myth to separate us from having a full voice around the unique ways that racism shapes and distorts the lives of Asian Americans. And my interest in particular at this time in history is to really speak to the wicked combination of racism and sexism and how it finds itself in affecting the lives of Asian American women, which we saw dramatically in the Atlanta shootings. But sadly, that is not a unique example of the ways in which Asian American women have been so violently objectified and had power ripped away from us. So that's primarily my focus. My background is, I was born and raised in Oregon, and I'm a child of a biracial marriage. My father's Japanese, my mother's Caucasian. And I'm from the generation of biracial children who were very rare. And so if you weren't living in Hawaii, you really stood out as someone who didn't belong in either racial camp, we'll say. And so there is a sense of marginalization that is its own version of what Bishop Shin talked about in terms of tension on both sides, both from the white side and the Asian side, in terms of who are you and how do you identify yourself and how do we understand your voice as authentic. And the last thing I will say about saying yes is for the Asian American community to recognize its own diversity, not just in terms of ethnicity, but in terms of economic wealth and the conversations that we need to continue to have in our communities, and also the conversation we need to have with our African American and Latinx brothers and sisters, so that we continue to keep that conversation about racism and sexism, a full spectrum conversation, and not just one that is allowed to polarize between, for example, Blacks and whites, because there's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, within our racial ethnic communities. And so this is for me, this is a historic moment, not just in the church, but in our country, for all of us to enter into a conversation that does not privilege any voice, but allows us all to listen to each other and respect each other and hopefully get to a new place.
Hi, I'm the Reverend Manoj Matthew Zachariah. I serve as rector of the historic St. Anne's Episcopal Church on Church Circle in Annapolis, Maryland. At the outset, I'm just grateful to be part of this panel so that I can actually engage in deep conversation and learning with all of you and hear your voices. More specifically, the reason why I said yes to being on this panel is because as someone who has served the wider church in 4 different churches in communion with the See of Canterbury, I've sort of seen the international flavor of anti-Asianism throughout the Anglican Communion. So one, the sort of anti-Asian sentiment is not only parochially a national phenomenon, but I would say it's a much more global phenomenon. That's one. So part of my contribution in this conversation would perhaps be to elucidate that in many ways. Secondly, post 9/11, coming back to the United States from another country, it was extremely shocking to see how I felt that I was treated. I felt that my family was treated. Having lived in and around New York, being a child of the Diocese of New York, it was just interesting to see a different take on, one, a city that I love, 2, a country that I love. And being away for 7 years and coming back to the United States post 9/11, and with the last name Zachariah, it was truly difficult. So sort of navigating that reality and living into my vocation as a priest has been interesting for me. Third, with this recent episode or highlighting of Asian American violence, what I found interesting was, as Bishop Diana said, the nexus between race, class, gender, and I'll also add sexuality. Just the underpinning and the comorbidity of these 4 angles has really been fascinating to me from my perspective. So I'm truly grateful to be part of this conversation.
Great, thank you all. I just want to pick up on a few of these themes here. And one, Bishop Akiyama and Bernadette, Manoj, you mentioned this a bit too, is this sort of this combination of factors of racism and sexism that has been called to our attention through the news. I think most of us know that this has been going on for much longer than that. I wonder how, in your experience and work, you would describe sort of that collision of events in a way that would be helpful for us in better understanding what's been going on.
You know, I can speak to my experience being a priest in the church as long as I have. I was saying to someone recently, you know, where the church was when I was first ordained some 30 years ago and where it is now is the difference between me having a very difficult time being considered for a rector position in any size church to me being elected bishop today, which isn't to say the church has just done this amazing transformative work in every single way, but there is an opening now that certainly was not a part of my experience of the church when I was first ordained. And I really want to echo what Bishop Shin said, because the overarching shape of how I've made my way through is my faith and my love for the church. And so despite very unsavory experiences, quite frankly, with some commissions from 815 and other bodies of the church, I was never interested in leaving because my faith is who I am. And so my trajectory was to continue to find a way to engage my ministry in a way that was life-giving for me and allowed me to continue to proclaim the gospel. It has the voice around speaking into racism and sexism, for example, has been more difficult because you can speak because you want to and need to, but if no one is listening, then it really does feel like you're screaming into the wind. And so what's interesting now is that there seems to be a moment where folks really want to hear. They really want to ask questions and be in a position of listening as opposed to just telling those of us who are not straight white males when and where we can speak and when and where we can actually be visible and recognized as leaders in the church. So there has been a shift, but it is in no way is fully transformative, but it is an opening that I find encouraging, and also a moment where groups like this that are leaning into it and saying, let's have a conversation. And prior to this panel starting today, the conversation was really how this will be ongoing, right? So it's not just a one-off kind of thing. It is the beginning of many, many conversations, and this isn't the only body that has been saying that. So I think that one's faith makes a huge difference. And I don't mean that in a superficial sense. I mean that in the sense of when it gets really difficult and very uncomfortable and sometimes even confrontational, that our ground is always the word of the gospel and how we're called to hang together and be community and to forgive each other.
Beautiful, thank you. Bernadette, did you want to jump in on that combination of racism and sexism and how you see that play out in your work?
Yeah, well, I in our work, organizing work with Filipino and other Asian, mostly Asian survivors of trafficking, there's also the aspect of being an immigrant, right? And having to navigate through the power structure of known as the immigration system here in the United States. And so I think for what I organize with, the communities that I organize with, majority of whom are women. I mean, of course, being a woman myself, I grew up in Southeast San Diego. I don't know if you're familiar with Southeast San Diego, but it's it's not like the rest of San Diego in that it's predominantly low income. A lot of it is ghettoized. And I grew up with a mixture of many Filipinos, many African Americans, and many Latinx. All and never. I've always felt very safe in that community because of the solidarity amongst those of us who are disadvantaged, right? But I think, of course, being a woman and being Asian, there is that history of hypersexualization of images in mainstream media, which the society also adopts. And coming here to New York and entering the workforce, having to confront those types of misconceptions and misguided attitudes towards Asian American women in general in a multiracial society, and even from the countries that we come from, no? Misguided conceptions because of what the media, mainstream media perpetuates. So, and I think for many of the women that we advocate for, that we organize, who are immigrants, no? And the type of work that they are offered mostly are work that is not only in many ways demeaning and lower pay, but also risky in the sense that at any given time, because you're a woman, you can be taken advantage of in another way, you know, usually in a hypersexualized way that, you know, many people don't talk about, but it's the truth. And it's the reality of many Asian women migrants here in the United States who leave their children behind, you know, to raise other people's children, you know, and that's heartbreaking enough, but to also have to deal with multiple layers of abuse and denigration that is many of it just tied to their being a woman. So I think it's important that I mean, one of the reasons why I also wanted to be on this panel because I think conversations like this, especially within the faith community, help to break down these misconceptions and also foster solidarity. Like I said, never have I felt more safe than when I'm in the presence of those who are also at a disadvantage, you know? And I think the solidarity between those of us who are at a disadvantage, those of us who are perceived to have less power because we do have less power in the society, I think is where I feel safest. And that's part of the work that we do in MAMS is we try to build bridges of solidarity between those of us who are at a disadvantage in the society that we live in. Yeah.
That's great, thank you. And you're reminding me, Bernadette, there was a sort of a rally and prayer vigil, and even here in Birmingham after the shootings in Atlanta, and because there's no organization behind the Asian American community in Alabama, many of the Black Lives Matter folks helped step in and make that event happen. So I'm wondering what other experiences, or just how you perceive some of this relationship with Asians and Asian Americans and our other minority sisters and brothers. Feels like there's some complexity to it because there's this standing in solidarity, and then particularly after some of our recent incidents, there's folks who are quick to point out that some of them were perpetrated by friends who are African American or of Black descent. So what do you make of that? How are you processing it?
You know, Katie, thank you for saying that, because I'm in many ways what it brings to the fore is the class dynamics that is also at play. So for instance, if we look back in history and reflect on what happened past the Rodney King trial and the conflict between marginalized groups, between African Americans and basically Korean Americans in the city of Los Angeles. What is striking in that incident and in many of the incidents that happen is that class continues to be a very relevant factor in this sort of sociological analysis of conflict between groups that are not of European descent. So it's just, I think it's what happens, just to be a little bit more theological, is that the enemy works in many ways. And one way is to divide and conquer, in the words of C.S. Lewis, as highlighted in the Screwtape Letters. So it's just a way where solidarity, where there should be, ostensibly there should be solidarity, that solidarity is rife with conflict because of underlying class dynamics, and which is a result of a Euro perpetuated capitalist system.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think I offered as example yesterday, the Filipino community in particular, in this climate of now increased visibility of anti-Asian violence, because it was always there, just being visibilized now by the media. The Filipino community in particular, and I'm Filipino, is organizing around I'll share two particular cases and two particular individuals in separate ends of the United States. One is Angelo Quinto, who is a 30-year-old Filipino man, was, because he's dead now, who was suffering a mental health crisis in Antioch, California, which is in the Bay Area. Angelo's parents, all of them are immigrants, but Angelo's parents, not really being versed in the challenges of mental health, while he was experiencing his breakdown, called the Antioch police, called in law enforcement to help their son. And when the Antioch police arrived, they responded by restraining him. And by restraining him, they did apply the knee to neck procedure, which rendered him unconscious, and he died of asphyxiation in the hospital. Conversely, here in New York City, not too long ago, that was back in December. Conversely, just a few weeks ago in Midtown Manhattan, a 65-year-old woman by the name of Bill Macari was walking down the street, was walking to church, and she was assaulted by a black African American homeless man on the street, and who also has mental health issues. And he kicked her several times, knocked her on the ground, bruised her, broke some bones, and it became news all over New York City. She is still alive, thankfully, and is recovering. But I mean, we can file this all under anti-Asian violence that's happening in the United States right now, and it is, in the sense that both the victims are Asian, but the assailants are two different types of assailants, right? One is linked to power and white supremacy, which is a term I don't use lightly because it is linked to power for us to understand it, to maintain the power structure in society. One is the police, which is linked to power, which maintains white supremacy. The other was a homeless Black man who has no link to power, who doesn't have the resources to cover up what he did, whereas the Antioch police are trying to cover up what they did. They have the media, they have the local city government, they have the state to help them cover up their crimes. The homeless man, Brandon Elliott, I believe is his name, went through the whole, was homeless, went through the whole prison pipeline, and had mental health, real mental health issues, which many in his community deal with, because in the African American community, you have a whole history of not just slavery, but even in the more recent history, the ghettoization of Black communities, the drug war, which also rendered many in the community with mental health issues. So, and these communities don't have power, in this day and age. So I think we have more in common with people with communities who don't have power than we do with agents that do have power, who have the resources to cover up their crimes, So that's why I think solidarity is important, that we elevate the conversation. And I'm glad that this is called anti-Asian American violence in context, because we have to look at the context of these incidents, and we can't just say, call in more law enforcement, which which is what many in the Asian American community are calling for now as the solution. Actually, we actually need more cops. We don't need more cops. We need more mental health services, you know, for communities at a disadvantage, for communities who are powerless. We need more understanding and solidarity and education in our communities, and more alternatives, you know, for our youth who are coming from these disadvantaged communities.
Thanks, Bernadette. Bishop Shin, were you jumping in?
Yeah, I think they're both, I agree with both panelists, but I also think that the solidarity cannot be taken for granted. It does not happen naturally. It takes education, it takes formation, it takes work. Because solidarity is about relationships, building relationships, and its building and relationship building is a lot of work, even in its basic level. But aspect of classism that Manoj talked about is the whole issue of the label minority, the model minority myth of the Asians, where the model minority label actually is a patronizing racist label that is set up by in the white supremacist structure. So Asians are accepted as fake token whites because Asians behave and they you know, excel and all of that successful in the mainstream society. But there's a limit to that. There's a glass ceiling always, and I've experienced that in my life. But also it's a wedge that is, and a weapon actually that is used against African Americans and other disadvantaged minorities. I heard about this podcast by of Christianity Today, evangelical magazine, where in this podcast, the editor of Christianity Today was interviewing an African American journalist, and this person was a white editor of Christianity Today. Actually asked this interviewee, why is it that African Americans cannot be model minorities like Asian Americans? So that's, and she probably said it mindlessly and maybe even meant it in a positive way, but it was very clear this is a very dangerous racist weapon and a put down against African Americans. So the whole issue of this, you know, this, or somebody in the chat box said that racial violence is a very complex issue, but it has to be looked in the context of the racism structure and the system of racism in this country, root of which is, I'm afraid, is always white supremacy.
I think when we talk about white supremacy too, some people object to it. I've run up against some criticism for using it already here, because it really names an overarching system. And if you haven't read Wilkerson's book Caste, I think that's an important book to read, because she really frames our system in a way that does not let any of us out of it. And she frames it in such a way that helped me really begin to see how I think one of the people viewings called it horizontal violence versus vertical violence, and really helped me see how if we only look at this in terms of how to solve the problem between Asian Americans and African Americans, or if we only look at it in terms of straight white males, solving a problem with African American communities, we're still not seeing the water we're swimming in. And the water we're swimming in has all of us aligned in a caste system and speaking out of that position that white supremacy has put us in and is keeping us in. And so I think perspective, and this goes to the other question I saw in the chat box, is, it doesn't matter if your congregation is predominantly white and wealthy, if you're actually engaging the gospel word, and if you're actually thinking about what Presiding Bishop Curry is saying when he's talking about love. He's not talking about sweet, sentimental love. He's talking about the power of love to transform. And I don't know if he's using language that's more extreme, but I would say, to do work around anti-racism, anti-sexism, and so forth is to be a disruptor. And to be a disruptor and to be Christian is to really understand how love, following the way of Jesus and practicing that form of love, is disruptive. It's a disruptive activity. And so what does it mean for your congregation to really examine what it would mean to engage your faith at that level? It doesn't really matter where you are in the demographics. If you see your call as a Christian to engage love as a disruptive activity to move against white supremacy, or as Wilkerson calls it, the caste system that has all of us caught up in that web.
Yeah, other panelists, this question, I want to make sure that you have a chance to respond to it and see it, is how can our churches foster solidarity within and between class and within and between marginalized people? Maybe particularly paying some attention to churches that are more traditionally aligned with power.
I'd like to speak to that. I think it begins with, this kind of work begins with learning, educating ourselves about our own history, our own participation. So this in our diocese, in the Diocese of New York, we've been doing a lot of active work in reparations, slavery reparations. And it all began with actually congregations going to their archives and the diocesan archives and public library archives, digging out the history. And they actually dug out the slaves in New York area, the record of slaves who built some of our churches, etc. So in the same way, our churches need to learn about the history of anti-racism, anti-Asian racism in this country, but also in the church. Asians have been in this country for generations, for centuries. Yet Asians have often been scapegoated with unspeakable violence at times. You don't belong here, or you're not American, are the two perennial messages that Asians have to deal with all the time. And the Episcopal Church, Asians have been part of the Episcopal Church for a century and a half. Since 1874, the first Chinese mission congregation was established in the Diocese of Nevada. And at the turn of the last century, a number of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean Episcopal churches were established. So Asian Episcopalians have been part of the Episcopal Church for over a century. Yet, when the President FDR enacted the Japanese Internment Act, the executive order, church at large was silent and indifferent. So far, in my brief research, I have not found any resolution speaking against it from any of the diocesan conventions or the General Convention during that period. But thankfully, one notable Episcopalian spoke up publicly against that executive order, President's own wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, believe it or not. So I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful. It so happens that, today is Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. Yes, it is. And it's kind of telling that we're having this conversation today. And I remember, I think it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer who said, silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. We cannot remain silent and indifferent anymore.
Beautiful. We have a couple of questions here. One is there anything that we talked a little bit about this, kind of like the broad scope of how we define Asian and Asian American. This participant asks, is there anything problematic about using the term Asian to describe people from so many different ancestries, cultures, geographies, races, ethnicities, religions, and backgrounds?
Yes and no. Yes, because exactly it's such diversity. When I lived in England for 9 years, I remember one day the census person came and knocked on our door. And so we opened the door and he said, I'm taking census and what are you? And I said, we're Asian. I said, you don't look Asian. I said, what? No, you look more like Chinese. So in England, Asian is Southeast Asian. Indians, Pakistanis, they're Asians. Far East Asians are Chinese. Japanese, Korean, Chinese, they're all Chinese. So it's it's a little confusing. And Asian, of course, is humongous diversity. Yet at the same time, we don't have, and also we have to talk about Pacific Islanders. They have Asian ancestry too. So it's a tricky issue, but we don't have the language to really encompass it. I don't know, maybe Bernadette or Manoj, you may have different ideas.
I'm personally, I'm not offended by, or I don't have a problem with it being called an Asian, no. I'm actually proud of it, no. Because my family does come from the Asian continent, which is diverse. I think it becomes a problem when the person calling you Asian is ignorant of the diversity of what that word means. And so I think there is a responsibility to learn all of what Asia is and not just strike it all with just one brush, I think it's the ignorance more than the terms that actually are offensive. And there's the ignorance, with ignorance comes misconceptions and presumptions that are inaccurate. And I think that is where we fall into these challenges of like, when people get offended, I'm more offended by people's ignorance than people calling me Asian. How's that? I think we have if we don't want to be more focused on the level of ignorance when a term is used than the actual term itself, I think is important. Otherwise, we'll just become going into like word games, and I think that's not the point. The point is about learning about diversity, and that Asia is not just all one type of people. No.
At the same time, Bernadette and Bishop Shin, thank you for that, because I think what both of you have said, and even implicit in that question, is the problem of taxonomy, which is rooted in an evolutionary perspective, which is rooted in a colonial mentality, which is rooted in post-1492. Christianity has become identified as a Western Euro-centered religion, And the irony in that is that Christianity actually has Asian and African roots. The level of complexity with using a term like Asian American, I love Bishop Shin was being the total Anglican of the both and, the problematic there. Yes, it is a problem, but it isn't a problem. At the same time, I think it's incumbent upon us, and this goes also to a question about what churches can do, is what it highlights is a deep formative issue in terms of our theological formation and understanding. So I'm going to focus this a little bit more on clergy and seminary education. When the Episcopal Church forms priests, is it with a global perspective, or is it a very parochial perspective? Secondly, what are the theological resources that are being utilized? I mean, let's leave the patristics aside, which are African and Asian. Okay, let's leave the pre-5th century theological resources aside. Are we more relying in our theological formation and theological vocabulary of people rooted in the European continent, disregarding other theological voices that should be shaping how we preach the gospel in a very global and very multicultural United States that we have? These are some of my weird ponderings, and that can translate into EFM as well. Looking at EFM curriculum for lay folks.
Yeah, that's a great start, I think, to answering a couple of these questions, which I think have some similar attributes, and basically they come down to what does it look like to actually like walk the walk, walk the talk. Sometimes I find that Episcopalians are great at talking the talk, but what are the practices that within dioceses, within parishes, folks can do to actually act on some of this?
I think a lot of it is you have to start where you are. One of the things that is very problematic are liberal folk who want to believe they're farther along than they actually are. And that's not helpful, because that says to me, you haven't done your work. So there's an internal piece that we have to not only do, but keep doing to remain honest with ourselves. And then I think the next measure that one can tap into within oneself to understand where you are in the conversation is, where is your level of fear and sense of being threatened? Because wherever that is where you're probably feeling uncomfortable because something is moving you. You're being shifted out of a position of comfort and perhaps privilege. And so that should be a source of inquiry and hopefully wisdom in engaging in conversations one-on-one, as well as community actions. And I think, when it comes to, someone mentioned reparations and other kind of what I think of as more tangible ways to respond. We have to educate ourselves, we have to organize ourselves, and we have to be very clear about why it is we're moving in that direction, because there's always going to be pushback. There's always going to be some kind of argument about how this is divisive, and whatever the terms are that white supremacy wants to use to devalue and displace the work, which is to say, one has to be ready for the long haul. Fighting oppression in all its forms is a lifelong engagement. And one of the things that I find discouraging are people who want to roll up their sleeves and quote unquote do the work And in the back of their mind, imagine that in X number of years, they'll be done and they can move on. You're never done. You'll take this to your grave. And to engage it with that long-term understanding is, I think, most possible when you are grounded in your faith, because hoping for a result in your lifetime is a sure and certain way to burn out and become cynical.
If I may just add that, you know, I'm not ordained, but I think that I just want to point out that while there's a long history of racial oppression and discrimination and power struggle, I think there's just as long a history of those of us who are powerless fighting back, you know, who are organizing, who are building our own power and not waiting for it to be handed to us. No, not necessarily waiting for reparations, but already fighting back. And I think it's important that that if we are true to what we say about wanting to be a part of the solution, that we also integrate ourselves with social movements that are led by those that are the most impacted by these power structures. No. So I mean, in this case, people of color who bear the brunt of institutional racism or white supremacy, whatever term you want to use, who are actually organizing and building movements to fight back. And I think that's where, if the church or the faith community can move closer towards supporting these movements, supporting organizing within oppressed communities, I think you'll learn a lot. If we're seeking education, I think we'll learn more from those who share their stories and who are organizing to fight back than, you know, more so than within the confines of a workshop. So, and I think it's important that we integrate with in those communities. Yeah.
I really do like what everyone has said about, you know, the history that Christianity has deep Asian and African origins. So knowing the foundation and the foundation that Bernadette is talking about, the foundation of working across lines, of building coalitions, knowing history, as Bishop Shin has talked about, you know, you just begin to realize you have a much bigger foundation to stand on than we are allowed to believe by a structure that really does not want us to have the full sense of voice and conviction that is already available to us once we begin to piece together history, what we're standing on, the facts and figures of the past, and how it is that combining voices gives us a much stronger, more solid foundation than we originally thought we had.
I also want to say that as we as Asian Americans or Asian immigrants, Asians in this country, have a lot of work to do to educate ourselves. You know, when I came to this country in 1972, I knew nothing about race or racism. Even though I remember watching civil rights documentary on PBS, but it was sad and awful to watch, but it didn't affect me because I saw myself as an outsider still, and didn't realize that how much I'm actually now becoming part of. And Paul uses the metaphor of being grafted onto a tree. And Asian immigrant, what I've realized is that as an Asian American immigrant, I am actually now grafted, not just into American history, but also history of Asian Americans in this country. I am part of it. A past Asian American history is part of me, and I am part of that history. And so there's a newly upcoming new immigrants really have a lot of work to do themselves to really learn and study about this, because it is unavoidable part of their life and their being in this country.
And and that has a lot to do with the role of shame. When I think about, the effect of the Japanese internment camps on my parents' generation, and the way that shame has silenced us and sort of caused us to separate ourselves from knowing our history, from even speaking the language, because we're trying to prove that we are American. And the ways that plays into this crazy making thing, particularly with Asian Americans, around being visible and invisible, and how that creates a strange schizophrenia around developing one's voice and leading into being publicly recognizable as someone who can speak out on these issues.
Yeah, and there's some great conversation going on in the chat related to that. Anthony Guillen is on here and is talking about the experience of people of Latin American descent, and saying much of what you address is here also relates to that experience. But then there's some conversation about kind of that mystery of finding not just identity as Asian Americans, but also our voice, and some of the resistance to comparing ourselves to other historically oppressed groups such as African Americans, because we don't have that history of slavery necessarily, but figuring out how that voice, how we use our voice, particularly in this moment.
So
you said some things in the past about this, about that,
yes.
that voice, and I'm wondering if that's what you're about to jump in and say.
That is what I'm about to jump in with. The presence of migration of Asians to this country, and also much of the American continent and Caribbean islands, happened largely right after the abolition of slavery. That's because European colonists needed labor. So if you study, Erica Lee writes about this in her book. And so in the 19th century, 1800s, hundreds of thousands of Southeast Asians, Filipinos, Chinese, indentured laborers, they're no longer slaves, but indentured laborers, who were brought over largely by Portuguese and Spanish colonists. Macau and Manila were the two largest labor markets in Asia during that time. So in a way, Asian migrant workers inherited the different form of slavery in this country. And they became not slaves, but indentured laborers who were not very different from slaves, really, because they could never pay back the, you know how it works. They could never pay back the money that they owe to the owner who owned the company. So that is really largely the history of how Asian migrants came to this country. Later on, and of course in the later 19th century until 1943, Asians were barred from coming to this country, from Chinese Exclusionary Act to Asiatic Barred Zone, and it was not repealed until 1943. So that is why we have not that many Asian immigrants during that time. And then of course, 1960s changed everything, and we had a floodgate of new immigrants. So it's a complex historical and very interesting history, a historical phenomenon for Asians. So I think, first of all, in knowing that how we become part of that history, and yes, we are not the same as African slaves. Yes, that cannot be compared. But we also have, and Asians have, historical experience of oppression and injustice done to us.
And Alan, just to get the citation clear, because Erica Lee has written several books, are you talking about her most recent one, The Making of Asian America?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Yes.
So as Bishop Shin was saying that, the post-1960s story, one interpretation of that story can be the United States needed labor in terms of science, technology, engineering, and math. So they turned the immigration floodgates open. I mean, so I'm a direct descendant of that.
Filipino nurses. I'm
Right.
sorry.
Yeah, no,
Filipino-
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. My parents came, my father came to this country from that perspective to utilize that that sort of capital. And so in that way, it's also a form of capital engagement of labor, hence the race class nexus that rears its head in many ways, but it's taken on a different trajectory. And so even in that, I mean, I was amazed as a child. For instance, Bishop Shin talked about 1972 and growing up. My first experience of or finding out that there have been Asians in this country since the 1800s was when I met Father Winston Ching when I was 9 or 10 years old, and hearing someone who clear Asian American who speaks like an American and did not speak like my parents was just it was interesting to me. And then hearing and investigating and understanding the story behind the utilization of Asian labor in building this country, and sort of the profiteering off the backs of people who were either forced to come to this country, slaves, or indentured servants, or in the modern era, those whose brains were used for STEM projects.
Yeah, I mean, the name of my organization is Mission to End Modern Slavery. So, and so on the current day, and we were founded in 2014, became independent in 2016. We work with migrant workers who work as cheap labor, because this country, this economy was founded on not only slave labor, but continues to be sustained by cheap labor, or many times slave labor as well. If you're not being paid, by the definition, you are essentially a slave. So, and in this day and age, I work with women who are not being paid, who are only not being paid, or also being kept, in basements of their employers. And so for me, yes, we can talk about our history, and it's important to do that to understand our present. But let's also talk about our present, and also how I work with workers who have found their voice through organizing. And I think so much of the system silences your voice, invisibilizes you. But when you're around those who are like you, and you begin to conduct that education process where you learn from each other, you also learn that you have a history, and this is not just happening to you or your immediate community, but has been happening systemically for decades. And within those decades, there's also efforts and movements to stop what is happening. I see men and women find their voice in that process with each other. And so, just to answer your question more directly, Kate, I think in finding our voice, we find our voice in collectivity. We find our voice, and I know that's also just a word, just like solidarity is a word, but it's a process, and really is a painstaking work, right? Which really requires humility, and the humility to say, I'm going to start from ground zero, and not only that, but I'm also gonna unlearn so much of my miseducation to be able to learn the truth. So, and I think it happens. I've seen everyday workers every day finding their voice through organizing and through that process. So if it can happen with workers, it can happen with the broader faith community.
Mm-hmm. We got several comments in the chat and Q&A box that for me sort of amounts to how do we get our fellow Christians and fellow Episcopalians to acknowledge that this work of reconciliation and justice is important at all, and is the work of the church. And I wanted to share an incident that happened with me several months ago. I was meeting with a parish development committee that was talking about where to plant churches in their diocese. And I just threw out there, are you interested in planting some churches with people who are not part of the white majority? And the first answer to that was, well, no, and the answer that was given was everybody needs Jesus. And so we'll just plant churches and see who comes. And, I was kind of like, no, now wait a minute. As an Asian American woman, my experience has been that while I love the Episcopal Church, I walk in and I see all white men on the wall of rectors, and the vestments never fit me. And the leadership style that's expected is not my leadership style. And that just kind of reminds me of that truth of, folks on that committee were like, oh, we never realized that that's your experience of our diocese. And so I think that some of this is really, it's about sharing our personal stories and experiences and saying, even within our organization, there's things that are, that make people other, and that are unjust. Practical steps. I'd love to see more of our dioceses look at their pay structures and see how many people of color are 1/4 time and 1/2 time. And particularly in new planting situations, sometimes we see these Asian American churches as the icing on top of the cake, not as part of the church itself. So those are some of the practical steps that I see. Let's see. I know we're almost at our time. Any of our panelists, any sort of closing thoughts or things that you would like to say to the wider church as we continue in this conversation?
Yeah, I would like to say a word in closing. I believe that racial justice and healing is an unavoidable focus of the church's mission in the post-COVID time. It is now, but will be more so in the post-COVID time. And I pray that our churches do not try to avoid it, but really embrace that as a mission of the church. Maybe we are on the cusp of a spiritual awakening, of some kind of awakening, because despite all these articles in news media about the declining religion and declining church and all that stuff, I still believe that people are hungry and thirsty for the message of healing, message of love and mercy and justice, and so I think that Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement, as our presiding bishop would like to call it, is well poised and ready to lead this mission. I'm really hopeful about that. And I pray that our churches, the Episcopal Church and our churches and the parishes will actually be the leaders in that work. I think we can.
Yes, and I think one of the ways we do that is helping congregations understand how to practically enter into these conversations. And part of that is taking the risk and getting to the point where not having the right answer all the time is just fine. There's Episcopal Church has a lot of overachievers in it. So we want to get the answers right on all the exams or questions, but this work means that you have to risk being vulnerable and being wrong. And that's part of how we grow together and learn. And, you know, I would say that particularly to priests who are leading congregations, because everyone is facing pushback. And so how do we invite people into those conversations where it's not just about who's right and who's wrong, but how do we risk really being vulnerable so that we can really be community?
Beautiful, thank you. Bernadette, there's a question, if you would not mind placing the link of the organization you work with in the chat box. I think there's some folks who would love to look that up. And I think this is our time. Obviously, we didn't get to cover the vast expanse of topics that we could have gone through, but luckily this is only the beginning of the conversation. We really want to thank SEEP, and I know that this is kind of the front runner of many conversations they're going to be hosting this year around race and justice and reconciliation. So stay tuned for more. And panelists, Bernadette, Diana, Alan, Manoj, it was wonderful to be speaking with you. And thank you so much for sharing on this really vulnerable and valuable topic. Thanks to all those who joined and listened in and posted in the chat box. We really appreciate you being here and sitting in solidarity with us in this moment. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.